Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing the Climate, a show where we talk about the changing world around us and how we can make it better. Brought to you by Climate Change Realty. All right. Hello, everyone, and we are back with another episode. I am very lucky and excited to have the River Warrior with me this week. So, Gary, thank you so much for being here, man.
Ethan, thank you for having me on your show.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I love to get the show started with a little bit of background on who you are and how you got to be doing what you're doing today.
Well, I've been more or less an environmental advocate all of my adult life. And then probably, I worked in government, I worked in academia, got a doctorate at CU Boulder in environmental geography, and been kind of doing this work more or less all my life. About 20 years ago, I started specifically doing river protection work, and then also got involved with climate change work, and worked for a few different nonprofits, run my own nonprofits. So I kind of, my specializations now, I would say, are river and water protection. I'm still engaged in the climate debate somewhat, and I've got increasingly engaged in the issues around population stabilization, which of course, if you think fighting dams is controversial, to start talking about stabilizing the population, and people get riled up pretty quickly. So it's a fascinating world in environmental advocacy. Let's just say there's no shortage of work if you can find a way to get paid for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, well, we're working on it. And yeah, so I found Gary. What I do is I actually just Google climate change Boulder and see what comes up. So Gary wrote an article about greenwashing in Boulder, which is how we're going to get this conversation started. Because I bring a lot of people in town on the show and we talk about how much we love Boulder, how it's an amazing place to live. And this show's about discourse. So I think we should kind of get some other perspectives on criticisms of Boulder. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I guess to get it started, Gary, do you want to explain what is the concept of greenwashing and kind of why do you think it happens?
Sure. I'm mostly active at the municipal level in Boulder and Fort Collins, and both of the communities are similar in some ways. Fort Collins is actually growing much faster than Boulder is. Boulder's population is kind of stabilized now. But I put out this concept of greenwashing growth, and it's especially true around climate change and climate emissions and climate emissions accounting, where the cities, both Fort Collins and Boulder especially, just doesn't count the emissions caused by growth. And so they make these claims that their emissions are going down, but the only emissions are going down are the emissions that they're choosing to count. In fact, they're not choosing to count emissions that are directly related to population growth. And so the whole thing is kind of growth biased. And both Boulder and Fort Collins are very similar. And most cities do this too, and Denver does it too. But you see it especially come out in Boulder and Fort Collins because both cities are claiming right on their websites that their emissions are going down, when in fact the emissions that are going down are the emissions that they count, and they're purposely not counting emissions that are related to population growth. So I call that greenwashing growth. And climate change is sort of taken over the public dialogue as really kind of the only environmental issue, which it isn't. There's lots of other environmental issues, of course, river protection, habitat protection, et cetera. But if you can claim that your emissions are going down, you throw up the green flag and say, look at us, look at us. And both Boulder and Fort Collins are doing that. And I think they both have some very obvious faults in their accounting methods. And some of it, I think, is done on purpose just to kind of greenwash the growth machine, as I try to call it.
Surely. So this idea of greenwashing would be kind of parading or advertising to potential maybe people who want to move. We can call them customers or people who are attracted to whatever you're doing and saying to them, hey, we're very green, we're very environmentally friendly. When in reality, the wash would be that it's just like kind of a facade is the idea, right?
Yeah, I would call it a facade, and it's not just to, it's not just advertising to potential customers or new consumers and new people who might move in. It's you're telling yourself you're telling your community a story too, that they are making huge progress, when in fact they're not making much progress. In fact, sometimes they're going backwards, but you're just not telling them. Boulder is a perfect example of this.
Hmm.
Because there's been this kind of massive construction spurt. If you just look at the corner of 30th and Pearl Street at the sort of Google phenomenon, and the luxury apartments that are being built around it, and the whole thing about Boulder Junction and how we got to add density and just pack more people in, and by golly, that's going to solve climate change. It's all a ruse. They're not counting any of the emissions associated with any of that construction at all. And so they're just making these, claims that just evaporate when you look at them from, like, kind of a simple mathematical formula.
Yeah, and Gary listed several different examples of emissions that are part of growth and building buildings. Like example, we had the Green Builders Guild on a couple weeks ago talking about the emissions that are not taken into account when you build the home versus like when you're operating the home. I'm curious, what kind of relationship do you think affluent populations has with large carbon footprint?
Yeah, kind of throwing me softballs there, aren't you, Ethan?
Yeah,
So I
we got to make
mean,
it. We got to ease into the show, man. We'll get
I
into the
know, I
deeper stuff.
know. The number one correlation and causation of emissions is affluence. So, the wealthier people are, the more their emissions. I mean, it's that simple, and it's that way everywhere. Wealthy people live in nicer houses, bigger houses. They buy more stuff. They consume more stuff. They drive farther. They fly farther. They eat more expensive food. The wealthier you are, the bigger the bubble gets. And so, it's absolutely true that wealth and affluence is the number one driver of climate emissions. And, that's not to say that you should force people to be poor, but it's important to point that fact out, because somehow this concept that we're going to be able to grow and people are going to be able to get richer and more affluent, and we're also going to solve the climate crisis. These are, I think, kind of the silly stories that America tells itself and Colorado tells itself. By golly, we're going to grow. There's going to be more economic growth, and we're going to, like, drive down emissions. These are, greenwashing stories that, in my opinion, aren't true. And I think the facts would support my opinion.
Yeah, well, fair enough. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, so I've spent a lot of time going door to door. So I really talk to the citizens in Boulder, and something that comes up a lot is a lot of people in town are huge advocates of more affordable housing in town. And I was just curious, and they seem to think, is this sort of associated with a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions somehow? Do you think that's incorrect, or people just kind of misled on what would happen if we had more people living in place with more affordable housing?
Well, those two things are tied together, and I think it's often erroneously tied together. The the housing justice people, and I would count myself as one of those. Want more affordable housing. Boulder is a very expensive place to live. It's always been that way, by the way. 35 years ago when I came, it was still more expensive than anywhere else around. Fort Collins is a very expensive place to live, not as bad as Boulder. But the concept that you can just keep building more and more and packing more and more people in and drive down housing prices, really doesn't work in a place like Boulder or Fort Collins that have such huge demand. In fact, you sometimes get the kind of reverse curve where the more housing you build, you actually drive up the kind of frenzy around purchasing, and prices will go higher and higher. If you want to get affordable housing, there are ways to do that, but building more and packing people in denser and denser are not the solution, in my opinion. Now, it's kind of a separate issue, but in addition, that does not ever drive down climate emissions. And so, people try to connect affordable housing to climate emissions, and those things are not connected, and they shouldn't be. And it's unfortunate that Boulder promotes this Denver promotes it. You're seeing the same conversation in Denver. And the state of Colorado is promoting it too. If you want affordable housing, there are ways to get it. It's the long arm of government, it's taxes, it's buying housing, subsidizing people, et cetera, et cetera. That's how you get affordable housing. But just trying to pack more and more people in smaller and smaller space with this magic wand that's just going to make it so dense and so many houses that the prices are going to go down. It doesn't work in a place like Boulder, especially because demand is so high.
Mm-hmm. So, how we talked about growth 2 weeks ago, I believe, before this episode, and how it's basically kind of baked in into our society that GDP we want to grow, population's going to grow, your salary is supposed to grow. How can we kind of change the paradigm and convince people that hey, we're already living way beyond our means. We actually should maybe shrink our consumption. How could we possibly turn something around when people are completely conditioned by this growth mindset?
That is the $64 million question, I would
There it is.
say. And it's fascinating. Once you start, it's like a lot of things. If you buy a Subaru Outback, you suddenly see Subaru Outbacks everywhere on the car. If you start thinking about growth all the
Cognitive
time,
bias.
yeah, you start seeing it everywhere. And it's true. I mean, the growth bias in American society is phenomenal. It has completely taken over both political parties. I know
Yeah.
we're always talking about the partisanship in America and how the parties are at war with each other. Not about growth, they're not. Everybody's pro growth. The Democrats are pro growth. The Republicans are pro growth. So the kind of growth has taken over American society, and the gross domestic product, which one of my favorite authors. Now this wasn't always this way. I mean, I'm a little older than you. You're a
A
young
little
man.
bit.
You got your whole life ahead of you. Yeah. So, but back in the 60s and 70s, we talked about growth all the time. I mean, Small is Beautiful was a famous book. The Limits to Growth. These were famous books. One of my favorite authors was Edward Abbey. He used to write about the grossest domestic product, and of course, America had it. And so, it's just been. It was kind of in the 80s where the Ronald Reagan mindset sort of came in. And
Mm-hmm.
then I would say once Bill Clinton came in, the growth machine sort of took over the Democratic Party with the Center for American Progress and other entities which were pro-growth and pro-environment. And one of my, I wouldn't call him a hero, but it was Al Gore who would stand up
Mm-hmm.
in front of huge audiences saying, we can have a strong economy and we can protect the environment. People just started pounding and pounding and pounding from both sides of the aisle that growth and gross domestic product was a positive outcome that we can all get. Well, there are limits to growth and there are realities to ecological health. And of course, we're bumping up into those all the time. Just real quick, and I'll let you ask another question.
No worries.
Because you got me wound up now, you can tell.
Good.
There's an organization called the Ecological Footprint Network. They're based out of San Francisco. And I actually had them on my TV show a few weeks ago on EarthX TV, the Ecological Footprint Network. And they calculate your ecological footprint. So it's not just your geographic footprint, like how big your apartment is or your house is or your yard is, but your actual ecological footprint, which incorporates all the products you consume and all the flights you take and everything you do and everywhere you go. And of course, America's ecological footprints are huge. We actually consume about 5 times the resources that are produced in America. So we're a big ecological consumer, whereas some other countries which are very poor will actually consume less resources than are produced in their countries. And America, of course, is out there snagging resources out of other countries and sucking them all into the United States. And so
Absolutely.
we have consumption problems, we have growth problems, we have population problems. We got lots of problems.
Yeah, those are just a couple offhand for sure. So I've obviously, since I spoke to Dave, I've been thinking about Dave Gardner. I've been thinking about this more and more, and there are plenty of scientific indicators to show that we are over consuming to the point where there's going to be some kind of collapse. I'm thinking about how do we effectively communicate this to the population to show, hey, we actually don't don't like, it would be good if we made a change. It's like, hey, we are living completely unsustainably and there's just going to be a collapse. I was thinking, do we need some kind of cataclysm to show people, like some sort of 9/11 COVID thing to get people to change their behavior? Because right away, as soon as the virus hit, everyone locked down and changed their behavior. This is, in my opinion, I guess I'm not supposed to say my opinion about the virus or whatever, but climate change is more pressing issue than a pandemic, in my opinion. And it's way too, I don't know, it seems way beyond time for serious action. I'm just trying to figure out, how can we actually accomplish anything?
Well, it's extremely difficult, and I'm not going to, provide any illusions. And also, what I try to do in my professional work is not pretend like, oh, if you just buy an electric car, we're going to fix the problem,
Mm-hmm.
or if you just buy that electric heating device and sell your natural gas or get rid of your natural gas heating unit, you're going to fix the problem. It is way more complicated. One of the things I like to talk about is what's I call the moving baseline syndrome. For example, when I first came to Colorado 35 years ago, or 36 years ago, um, you know, I-25 was not congested at all. Believe it or not, I-70 was not congested at all. You could drive right up to Vail and right back any weekend, any time of the day, and that was normal to me. Now, new young people move in, and their concept of normal is that it takes 2 hours to get to Copper Mountain, or that it takes, an hour and a half to get to Fort Collins if you're driving from Denver. And so we just see normal as something different. And because normal changes all the time, it's the moving baseline syndrome. And it's very difficult to communicate to people, just to be frank, that things are going to hell because, well, no, this is normal. And here's the other thing going on in the state of Colorado, because a lot of the people who are moving here are from places that are in some ways, frankly, more congested and more environmentally degraded, whether
Including
it's parts
myself.
of, whether it's, it's the San Francisco Bay Area or LA or wherever.
New
And
York.
you're used to sitting in traffic for 3 hours. You get here and it's like, what? It's only an hour. That's nothing. This is like easy street. And so,
Yeah.
it's very difficult. I don't have any illusions. I'm not going to leave like, oh, here's the solution. You got to do X, Y, and Z. But, try to raise awareness. You know, and I'm also, I'm almost 60 years old. I've been doing this my whole life. And I think I try not to have too much of a doom and gloom mindset, which is very difficult in my line of work.
Certainly.
But
I found that
you
as
got
well.
to stay positive. You got to do what you can and try to make a difference. But not think that, not internalize it so much that you get too depressed or you just consumed with the idea of apocalypse. I think it'd be very difficult to be a young person today like you, and actually be delving into these issues without seeing some kind of apocalypse potentially coming, because all the all the signals appear to be in the red zone, and whether it's biodiversity or whether it's climate change or whatever. There's my dog back there,
I see it. Yeah.
and habitat destruction, just crowding of people. Try to go for a hike on a weekend in Boulder County open space or Larimer County open space or Jefferson County open space. There's just the cars are packed at the trailhead. The trails are packed. It's hard to not see the red zone line everywhere you go.
Absolutely. And I'll say this. So I started in real estate last year, and a lot of my time was spent focused solely on the addiction to growth. Let's make a lot of money. Let's build the business. So I was having fun doing that. And I was starting to dabble in the whole climate space. And then I started this podcast last June, and it really got up and running by like September. And in the last couple months, I must admit, it's been very hard to keep a positive attitude as I learned about the Holocene extinction, the extent to which we're degrading our environment. So what you said definitely rings true for young people. And I have this position where I'm trying to spread this information to people, but I feel really bad about it because I don't want to be like, hey, by the way, this apocalypse thing is kind of like going on a little bit. So maybe we should like do something to fight it. I don't want to, like, after how I felt in like January, after truly looking into the destruction of biodiversity that's gone on in the last 20 years, it is deeply depressing. But I think having a faith just having faith in general, whether it be in yourself, in a higher power, or in humanity, I think is very helpful to keep moving forward. And then obviously, all we can do is keep moving forward. So I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned ecological footprint before, is that right?
Yeah, ecological footprint. Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about greenhouse gas accounting because honestly, ecological footprint sounds a bit more all encompassing, but I think people are focused right now, specifically when it comes to climate change, on the greenhouse gases because it's a very simple metric to measure. Do you think we're on the path to some kind of standard regulated way to do this? Because obviously you have an issue with the way Boulder does it, but I'm curious if you think there's somewhere where we can be like, these are the greenhouse gas accounting standards, and we haven't discussed this in weeks on this show.
Yeah, and so I'll try to dig into the weeds a little bit without making it overwhelming and
Thank you.
boring. um, there's a question about a city. Let's just take Boulder example. Boulder for the most part keeps track of the amount of emissions that are produced in Boulder.
Mm-hmm.
So the amount of gas that's bought, the amount of heating that occurs, the amount of electricity that occurs in Boulder. They don't keep track of the amount of emissions that Boulderites consume. So in other words, if you buy a Tesla that was manufactured in Texas, there's all these emissions associated with the production of that car. And they're big. There's steel, there's rubber, there's plastic, there's a whole entire factory, and the car just shows up there on the lot. And I'm not picking on Tesla. I could pick on a Chevy Volt too. But the car just shows up there on the lot, and you go drive it, and the city will say, "Aha! Well, that's a Tesla. Its emissions are like 2/3 less than if it was a gas car." But they don't add all the emissions of the production of the car and the shipping of the car here. So that's just kind of one example of greenhouse gas accounting and how it's biased for those kinds of issues. Again, it's like housing, for example. Steel is a huge greenhouse gas emitter. The production of it. Concrete is a huge greenhouse gas emitter. The production of it. Glass is a huge greenhouse gas emitter. The production of it. All of those things are produced outside of Boulder. In fact, the cement plant is down 93, a little ways towards Golden. The asphalt plants are outside of the city limits. And so all the roads, all the sidewalks, everything that goes along in this just kind of machine of growth and construction, the producers of it are outside of the city. And so the city doesn't count those emissions. And you can sit there in a really nice house that you put in the super efficient heater. You got your Tesla in the driveway, and you can feel like, yes, I'm doing it. Well, not true. I mean, there were massive emissions associated with the car being in the driveway and the construction of the house. I'm not dissing anybody because I try to keep it on policy, not personal. And I think that's important so that we don't, get into just a battling against people and lifestyles. But we need to change the policy about how greenhouse gas emissions are counted so that the cities are accurately counting the emissions. And, I'll give you another quick example because this is what comes up in the Boulder, and it ties to the affordable housing thing all the time.
Cool.
So Boulder claims, as you know, City of Boulder claims there are all these people commuting in from outside in Boulder, from Lyons, from Longmont, from Louisville, from Lafayette, calling the L towns, Broomfield, Golden. They're all driving in. They claim there are 60,000 commuters every day. Now that changed because of the virus. People stopped doing that. But then, the growth machine of Boulder claims, well, we got to build that much housing in Boulder so they will stop commuting.
The growth machine.
And then their emissions of driving won't occur anymore. And then this growth and packing all these people in Boulder is going to fix climate change. So, again, they're not counting any of the emissions associated with building, constructing, 20 or 30 or 50,000 housing units. They're not counting any of that. They're not looking at alternative ways. Like maybe you should just buy fleets of buses and put them in, Lyons, Longmont, Louisville, Lafayette, Broomfield, Golden, and just have them, busing people back and forth, back and forth. Maybe that's much more efficient at greenhouse
People
gas
don't like
emissions.
the bus though, especially in this country.
people don't like to bust, but here's the interesting thing in Boulder too. And again, it gets into the weeds, so just try to stick with me real quick. We're counting, if you have a natural gas heater in your house and you switch it over to a high efficiency electric heater, we count that change because you produced it in your house. But we're also counting people who drive in from Boulder. They're not even Boulder citizens, but we're saying that the city of Boulder is causing those emissions because we've overbuilt the number of jobs in town. And so it's the city. So we're counting the emissions of people who live in Frederick and drive to Boulder. Their emissions get counted. Well, why do those emissions get counted? But the emissions of building the massive, uh, concrete monoliths out on 30th and Pearl Street don't get counted. I mean, it's all over, and it's not just growth biased. Ethan, I would argue that it's actually rigged. The growth machine, and getting a little bit direct and confrontational, but the growth
Do it.
machine is actually rigging the emissions count to promote more growth. And it's the very same people who are now running the system at the state of Colorado. I'm not going to mention any names, but they came from Boulder, and now they're in the administration of the governor's administration, and they're actually promoting more growth and purposely not counting the emissions that they should be counting just to drive more and more growth. So there.
Yeah, there it is, guys. All right. Well, thank you for your thoughts, Gary. I appreciate it. It's good to know. Anyone who's listening, I'm happy they can hear your opinion. I want to ask you, what would degrowth actually look like in Boulder? So how could we possibly accomplish something like this when there's these plethora of millionaires living here who are very likely obsessed with increasing their wealth, and they have a great deal of it sitting in this physical real estate that the emissions aren't counted of? So what would a realistic degrowth plan even look like somewhere like Boulder?
Yeah, fascinating question. And again, I'm not going to throw up any illusions that we can degrow in Boulder or Colorado. Colorado's growing like crazy. But I think it's an important concept to put out there. Is kind of like, oh, you've got the growth machine over here. Let's talk about degrowth here, and let's just bring some balance to the conversation. As I mentioned, I have a show on Earth X TV, and we actually had a degrowth person, one of the global experts on the topic, on last week, and had a really great conversation.
Awesome.
Also with a person from the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. So there's the concept of growth, which we know very well. There's people called steady staters, which are trying to stabilize, growth and economic expansion, make it so it's flat. And then there's the degrowthers who actually think we need to consume less, we need to contract the economy. And so, I'm not claiming any illusion that it's possible or how you would do it. And the degrowth community isn't all completely in agreement with each other. Some of them are like,
we never are.
Yeah, some of them are like, they're Marxists. They believe that you should force people to consume less, and we should force an equality of consumption. And they actually, and I forget the phrase, but they say you should get a greenhouse gas, allotment. This is yours. You can spend it any way you want
on an individual level.
On an individual level, but you don't get any more. So, that's it. You get, and so, those are, extreme long arms of government kind of examples. And then there are also, concepts. I want to be just, a little bit, that's less kind of pie in the sky. There's lots, and I'll just pick one example. The former Boulder Community Hospital site, right there across from Ideal Market in Boulder. Obviously, the hospital, sold the building. The city bought it. The city has lots of choices they could do. One that they could do is degrowth it. They could turn it into a park in some kind of open space. I mean, there's a dramatic need for more parks in the community, rather than just packing more housing on the place. So, the city has lots of options. As you also noted, Boulder is a very influential community. And so, there's influential and affluent communities. So, and Boulder residents are also amenable to being taxed. So, you tax people and buy lots that haven't yet been developed, turn them into parks. There's a lot of things you could do that are degrowth, our system, you can start thinking about it. You can start putting it into the public consciousness to have a conversation a little more.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, I know you called it kind of pie in the sky when you talked about individual greenhouse limits. I get the gist that people don't really want to be equal in this country. So I don't think something like that would ever work. If everyone got the same amount of money or the same amount of greenhouse gas coins, I don't see that ever working. Even well, regardless, I'll throw my thoughts in. I guess we're just kind of on the end of the whole counting emissions, counting footprint talk. So if I remember correctly from business school, there's this financial accounting standards boards, and they're the ones who regulate GAAP, which is the generally accepted accounting principles. I'm curious if you think we need some kind of regulatory board that would generate some general greenhouse gas accounting principles, something like that. Can we get that going so everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, and so the folks at the Ecological Footprint Network, and they do this for cities, for states, for countries. They have all sorts of programs. One of the things that you can do is your greenhouse gas footprint, and you can actually calculate it. And so it's not just you driving the car, plugging it in, or pumping with gas. It's like how much the car costs to produce, how much your greenhouse gas emissions were. And if you go to a fancy restaurant in Boulder and have the sea bass that was flown in from Argentina, that the cost of flying in the sea bass and cooking the sea bass and everything is calculated in. So there are ways to do it. Absolutely, they're not done right now, and it's kind of I won't say it's cutting edge science, but it needs to be done, and it needs to be out there in public consciousness, so it's part of the conversation. Because right now, again, it's my opinion that the growth machine is purposely stopping that from being done because they don't want the story getting out. They love the story that we can just grow, and our emissions can go down, and we can save the planet. No, it ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. It is a hoax. I'm happy to call it out as a hoax. You're not going to, and just one example in the state of Colorado, in 2014, which is the last time the state of Colorado did an actual greenhouse gas inventory. I wrote a column about it. It was in the Boulder Daily Cameras, I recall, me and another colleague of mine.
Cool.
Population had gone up, and greenhouse gas emissions had also gone up too. And even though per capita emissions were going down, total emissions were going up because of the increase in oil and gas production and because of the number of people keeps coming. So, and this, you just said there was just a story in Britain, which I just tweeted if you follow me on Twitter, which I'm sure you do because it's this consequential tweet storm.
Everyone follow Gary on Twitter. I'm an official brand new follow as of 2
Gary,
hours ago. I'm in.
Gary Wockner. Britain just came out with a study. Electric cars do have less emissions. It is driving per capita emissions down, but because of population growth and people are driving more, total automobile emissions are going up. And so, state of Colorado, and again, I'm going to pick on my friends here in the governor's administration. They're saying, we got to just, more electric cars. At the same time, where there's 20, 30, 40, 50, sometimes 80,000 new people per year moving into the state. So yes, per capita emissions are going down, but you're never going to drive emissions, down totally in any consequential way as long as you're just growing.
Fair enough. And thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts and opinions on that. I really appreciate it. Now, I think I'd like to transition to kind of what you've spent most of your career working on, which is water conservation. And you've earned yourself this title of River Warrior. So I'll ask you, Gary, well, why do the rivers need you, man? Can't they fight their own battles?
One of the things I like to do in my professional work is speak for those which cannot speak. And rivers in the state of Colorado and around the Southwest U.S. and increasingly around the planet, because I've had the great good fortune the last 6 years, 7 years to do this work around the planet too. Rivers don't have a voice. We're the only voice for them. And oftentimes in the state of Colorado, long story, but I'll make it short, is, rivers can be drained bone dry. They don't have any right to exist in the state of Colorado. people have the right to drain the river, but the river doesn't have any right to exist. So I try to
Hmm.
speak for rivers and give them rights. One of the things I've kind of specialized a lot of my career, last 20 years, is about fighting dams and diversions. So trying to divert more water out of rivers. We try to stop that. Dams on rivers, which are hugely negatively ecologically impactful to rivers and the health of rivers. Why do I do that? I grew up along a river and I kind of ran wild, and it's just kind of in my DNA, I think, that people should run free and rivers should run free. We should all get to grow up alongside a river and run wild. When I had
Hmm.
little kids, 25 years ago, I moved to downtown Fort Collins, right beside the Cache La Poudre River. And, they kind of ran wild along the river like I got to do as a kid. But I think that wildness is under assault across the planet,
Absolutely.
across America, including in Colorado and including in our communities. And so it's one of the things I like to do is speak for those things which cannot speak, and rivers don't have a voice. So I try to give them one as best I can.
And I know you do. And as far as I'm aware, you're the executive director and co-founder of Save the Colorado. Is that right?
That's right. Save the Colorado. We try to protect and restore the Colorado River from the source to the sea. Also, fighting to stop dams up in Fort Collins on the Cache La Poudre River, organization called Save the Poudre, and work with other global groups around the planet, especially and including my own work trying to protect rivers across the planet.
Yeah. What's been your experience like founding this? It's a 501(c)(3). What's it called? Something like that?
Yeah, a 501(c)(3) is a a nonprofit to the IRS. So they call them 501(c)(3)s because you can raise money and it's tax deductible. So that's why they're 501(c)(3)s. Um, well, I'm a little bit of a nonprofit entrepreneur, I guess, which is
Awesome.
a bit of an odd beast maybe. And I've been very fortunate in my life to mostly do work that I love and I created myself and find a way to you know uh, live passionately and make a living. And you know that's probably about as good as it gets. So one of the most inspirational things for me is I had the opportunity to travel a lot the last 6 7 years, and people protecting rivers and nature around the planet don't have it nearly as lucky and as fortunate we do in the United States to be able to do this work professionally, and also oftentimes your personal life can be at risk in other countries, especially the developing world. So I try to speak for them too. I try to give them a voice. Most of my traveling, for example, I've gone to Peru, gone to Colombia, gone throughout Central America, some parts of Asia. I try to speak for these people and give them a voice on the international stage so that it can help support their work and defend their rights to try to protect rivers and nature in their home country too.
Yeah, very interesting. What actions do you think we can take as Coloradans to ensure the health of our waterways?
Um, Number one, deal with the problem of growth.
Hmm.
Growth is devouring the landscape. It is devouring wildlife habitat. It is devouring our rivers. I like to say that there's a famous environmentalist, David Brower, who many years ago used to work for the Sierra Club, and he said that every loss is permanent, every victory is temporary. So when growth is like just this like Pac-Man, it's like eating everything. You can stop a dam for a little while, but pretty soon there's just more and more growth and more and more growth. And so number one, deal with growth. Of course, the second, is water conservation. We use vast amounts of water here in the state of Colorado. We don't have to use that water. About half the water across the Front Range, about 40% in Boulder, is used to keep the grass green. So,
What
just
exactly
kind
does
of
that mean?
full stop. We irrigate the grass to keep the grass green in July, August, September. And that's where, half of all the river destruction comes from. It's just to keep the grass green. So it's not like you're not going to be able to drink water and you're going to die and you can't take a shower and brush your teeth. Somewhere around half the water is just keeping the grass green. And so
You mean that in a literal sense, like lawn grass?
Lawn grass, yes.
which achieves what effect besides aesthetics?
Uh, it's just a cultural phenomenon, where, if you look at if you're bored, look at the history of lawns. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's a landscape aesthetic that came to the United States from Great Britain, when the settlers came over here, and they brought it over to create these vast, Arcadian landscapes that were lush and smooth. And then, maybe made some sense in the East Coast and the Midwest where it rains, but then of course they brought it west where it makes no sense whatsoever in the state of Colorado. So we're draining and destroying rivers just to keep the grass green. So growth is one, and water conservation is probably the second thing that you can mostly do to protect rivers in the state of Colorado.
That's absolutely insane to me. And then it's something that someone would never think about. It's like, oh, my dad kept, my dad watered the lawn, so that's what I should do. But whatever, we're not here to tell people what to do. One thing I want to talk about as we're sort of getting towards the end here, we'll talk about your show at the very end. As I want to talk about something in opposition to growth and consumerism, which is something, a school of thought that I really enjoy, which is minimalism. This idea that the most important things in life aren't physical objects, aren't cell phones. The most meaningful experiences you've had in your life come from relationships with other people or experiences in nature. So, Gary, what's appealing to you about minimalism, or what is it?
Well, you're preaching to the choir,
I
brother. You're
know.
just
Well, there's
preaching
listeners
to.
too. It's not just me and you.
Um, there is, as part of the degrowth movement, actually, is just kind of the school of thought of minimalism. And again, you mentioned it earlier that growth and gross domestic product and materialism and purchasing power, and how big your house is and how nice your car is and how much stuff you can buy, and is so part of the American consciousness because you're just being pounded all day, every day with
Mm-hmm.
advertising to spend money and buy stuff. And we talked about generational concerns. When I grew up, there was a television in the house, and it came on at about 7 o'clock in the morning, and it actually went off at like 10 p.m. or sometimes 11 p.m. People your age don't even know this, but at 10 o'clock and sometimes 11 o'clock, the TV would go off. There were
Mm-hmm.
only three stations. They would play the Star Spangled Banner. The B-52 bombers would fly across the TV screen, all three channels, and boom, snow. That was it. Of course, now all media is 24/7. This thing is in your hand everywhere we go, and I'm as guilty as anybody. And it is in your hand, and it is functional because advertisers are pounding messages at you all day long. The
Absolutely.
tech companies are selling your data to the advertisers so that the advertisers can make money. And I'll get back to my point. One of my big concerns about younger people is that I didn't grow up with advertising pounded at me all day, and
Mm-hmm.
people my age which didn't exist. And now, as soon as you wake up, and if you're 10 years old or 11 years old or 12 years old or however you are, once you get a phone and a computer, you're being pounded with advertising. It's a deluge, and your whole life has become how you consume and what you consume, and a reflection of your consumer habits. And I think fascinatingly, there is a backlash to that, and maybe you're part of that. I think in some of the younger generations, the millennials, whoever they are, there's an increasing backlash to consumerism and this concept of minimalism. And by the way, degrowth, and a related concept that nature should have rights, or rights of nature. It's young people are kind of relearning and reinventing and kind of learning anew some of the things that were very common in the 1960s and 1970s around small is beautiful, degrowth. It's not the amount of junk you own, it's the amount of experiences that you have. And so I think you just said it well, but I'm actually seeing a movement. It's small, but there are people who just, turning off the phone, leaving the
Mm-hmm.
phone home, and going out into the world and experiencing it like we did not that long ago.
Yeah, and I think it's all about as far as you want to take it. I'm very open-minded and malleable, open to changing my opinions, but I tend to be a very extreme person, and when I get into something, I get very interested in it. And just shedding all this stuff over the last 4 years has given me this mental clarity to realize that the only thing that really is important in life, to me at least, is just relationships with other people, and you can't sell that on a marketplace, and you can't get, I mean, there's like ads for like dating and stuff, but yeah, I just wanted to bring that up at the end here before we get into discussing your newest project, which is this television show on, what's the network called?
EarthX TV, yeah.
Earth
So
XC.
EarthX is a nonprofit in Dallas, Texas. They kind of got famous because they had an Earth Day. They had the biggest Earth Day celebration on the planet for several years. And then last year, of course, when COVID hit and of course changed everything else on the planet, they couldn't have Earth Day because events stopped, and so they changed their platform over to a TV station, and
Mm-hmm.
so now it's called EarthX TV. And I have a show on the network called Overcoming Overshoot, and we have very similar conversations, just like
Mm-hmm.
yourself, just like we've had right now. And I try to have nationally recognized experts on the topics that we just, several that we just brought up: population growth, climate change, river protection, ecological footprint, that kind of thing, degrowth, rights of nature. I had a Rights of Nature show, which had a woman who founded a Rights of Nature organization in California, which is one of the big ones, called Earth Law Center, and Corinna Gore, who's Al Gore's daughter, and she founded the Center for Earth Ethics in New York, and had them on. And so, I guess one of the other things I would say is, if you're a kind of casual consumer of environmental information, you kind of get bombarded by the mainstream American environmental movement. But a lot of the really cool and more interesting stuff is going on sort of outside the environmental: rights of nature, minimalism, degrowth. We had a show about Ecocide, which is an international organization trying to change laws to make environmental crimes like actual, so you can prosecute a CEO of a corporation and put them in jail for environmental destruction, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on outside of the environmental movement that you normally hear about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've ever heard of a CEO actually going to jail, if I remember correctly, in this country.
Not yet, not yet.
Yeah. Well, we can keep working when the laws, we write the laws with our votes. So have you been enjoying the experience thus far? Is it kind of your baby, this show?
Oh yeah, it was my idea and my baby. I had some friends down there in Dallas, Texas. The benefactor and the founder of Earth Day is a guy named Trammell Crow. Fascinating story there. His dad was a very famous developer, Trammell Crow Industries, which is a global real estate empire.
Awesome.
And he was one of the kids who decided to kind of take it in a different direction, as a very hardcore environmentalist. Also, I might add, a Republican environmentalist. And some of the most interesting things aren't necessarily coming out of one political side or the other political side. There's just fascinating stories out there protecting the environment that are nonpartisan, including EarthX, which is kind of led by Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, Teddy Roosevelt created the national park system, didn't he?
Sure, he did. Yeah.
Yeah. No, can't forget. Well, Gary, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show today, man. I just would, at the end here, last question, just want to get your final advice for kind of promoting a more healthy planet. Number one, what steps would you recommend the affluent take to address these issues? And then number two, what advice do you have to the up and coming generation?
Yeah, I'll answer both those questions kind of at once, and it kind of ties to something you just said a minute ago. Go on a river trip. Try to pick one that's more than 3 days, maybe 4 nights, 5 nights, 6 nights, 7 nights, something like that. And get out there with some comrades. You can't use your cell phone because you won't have cell access, and just try to reconnect with who you are as a person, away from the technology, and in a community of people where you're having conversations and you have no choice but to have real conversations with the people on the raft trip with you. And so you can experience something outside of this kind of mediated life we all live, which is our culture and our capitalist machine, and the advertising that's pounding us all day. So if there's one thing I could suggest, whether you are affluent, as you suggested, or a millennial, is just to kind of step outside the machine and try to refeel and rethink and consider different ways of being.
Yeah, and you might be surprised at who you discover on a trip like that. So yeah, sounds good. Sounds like good advice to me. And Gary, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you today. Thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show. It really means a
Yeah,
lot
and
to me.
I'm delighted to be on the show. Thanks and good luck in your business and then also your TV show.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll see. All right, Gary. Thanks so
Yeah.
much. And everyone, I hope you enjoy the rest of your week and have a fantastic day. Take it easy. Thanks so much for listening to Changing the Climate, a podcast hosted by Climate Change Realty, the most innovative real estate corporation ever conceptualized. Visit ccrboulder.com today.